Hello and welcome back to the AWS Launchpad. I promised yesterday at this exact same time that we'd be having another game tech customer here on Launchpad to talk a little bit about their journey and their interactions with the cloud. So joining us here for this session is Trevor Hammond, Public Cloud Architect Lead at Ubisoft. Trevor, thank you for joining us.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, and then the two of us up here also are, I'm Nick Walsh, I'm a cloud evangelist at AWS, and then down the other end?
I am Robert with AWS. I'm on the developer relations team. And Trevor, let me just say that might be my job title, but I'd like to change it to Ubisoft's biggest fan. I'm so glad to have you here. I'm so glad to pick your brain about how Ubisoft made the journey to the cloud.
Cool. Yeah, we're happy to explain how we kind of started way back when and how we kind of jumped through those hoops to get to where we are today.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I know that there's a long timeline here, but we're going to try and condense it as much as possible into this 20-minute session.
Yeah.
So let's start off as broadly as possible. Where did Ubisoft get started with the cloud? When did this journey begin?
Okay, so Ubisoft started with Amazon, actually was our first public cloud provider we used, because it was about 10 years ago, so at the time there really was nobody else, right? And when we ended up starting getting into that, it was really about the flexibility and scalability for mobile games. So if you remember Farmville, social network games, things like that back in the day, and that's where we put our focus on to kind of give our teams the ability to deploy these games. And every game has that peak, and then from the moment of launch, it goes right back down, right? And you kind of stabilize eventually. And that's
well, hopefully, it's up and to the right, but the
up
reality.
And to the right, but every game eventually bleeds away, right? And you'll hit your niche players that are always there, but you have that, that critical mass in the beginning. And for us, cloud allowed us to kind of fix that critical mass where we could launch, do what we needed to do, explode, scale back in, and eventually bring it back into our data center. And at the time, what we were doing was really based purely on IT, managing IT. So what we were doing was, the Ubisoft IT department would get code from developers, and we'd deploy the servers and do all that. And we had the typical over-the-fence problem, pointing fingers at each other, the whole thing. And what ended up happening is we kind of evolved over time to focus more on getting our teams embedded with the game teams, in order to kind of alleviate that over-the-fence problem. And what we eventually found is that it doesn't scale very well at a global organization.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, right? Like for folks that may not be as familiar, could you talk a little bit more about the global scale of Ubisoft? Now, I know the cloud journey didn't start until early 2000s, like you had mentioned, but you at that point in time still had many global teams and studios and independent games that all sort of run in their own lanes. How difficult is it to be able to integrate or standardize across that?
So one of the interesting things when people think like a gaming company like Ubisoft, they think, well, Ubisoft, everyone is working on this game or everyone's working on that game, but ultimately we're a bunch of independent studios under the same umbrella, and every game is a unique project to itself. So you know how some companies might have this is their product, this is their website? Every game is that product. And every game has certain needs and nuances and different engine, different teams operating in different scale, different requirements from a latency perspective, things like that. And it became really challenging for us because we ended up having, we went from a handful of cloud accounts where we were helping people, and then when we got that scalability problem, we were at about 50, 60 cloud accounts, and it seemed like it wasn't something that was going to be sustainable. And ended up happening is we ended up entering into our whole DevOps era where everyone kind of moved forward into developers also became IT people. And the role of IT people had to change in the organization to now kind of, I guess you could say, instead of focusing directly on, hey, turning on that server, deploying that code, doing this and that, more supporting the best architectural practices, the best practices from a cost efficiency, and really trying to bring the knowledge that we have to the teams that are focused on making games. Because at the end of the day, our goal, we like to do IT really well, and a part of any game is IT nowadays, but at the same time, we make games at the end of it. We don't do IT. And the gamer or the developer's focus is always on delivering a successful game, not necessarily on doing some really cool, funky, experimental stuff.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that all these teams are kind of independent from one another, they're building their own games, they're focused on delivering the best product possible. And you also mentioned that created this kind of lack of cohesion around the cloud practices. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, so was that something that you had to push upon these teams? Was it something that they were seeking out? Can you walk us through that?
I would say it's kind of a mix between the two. I think at any large organization, you have a very large bell curve of skill at the organization. And you get a lot of people at Ubisoft that, even if they're not in IT, are really at that skill level of IT, and we could really interact back and forth and make some good recommendations and analyze stuff. And then you have other teams who are still kind of learning, they're kind of exploring their cloud journey. They're not necessarily in production yet, so we're kind of helping them along on how to manage things from a cost efficiency perspective. People first time in cloud, they don't think, I got to turn my machines off on a couple cents an hour, this and that, and the bills start to add up. Security, things that people never had to worry about now become issues. People are opening up SSH to the world, random things like that, right?
Yeah, better not open up SSH to the world.
Yes.
I was just going to say, when I heard your initial journey into the cloud, something that jumps out to me is that when you have a bunch of these games, which internally are entirely different products with different teams, there's probably a lot of duplicated effort or work, right? Every game may need its own authentication or login system, or like cinematics engine, like what have you, right? Extend that to anything.
Yeah.
And so by moving to the cloud from an IT's perspective, AWS managed services help to reduce the need to have that reduced work, that duplicated work across all those different teams, right?
Exactly. So one of the things that we have internally at Ubisoft that we've had for a long time is we have a lot of middleware platforms. And these help the game developers build the game, ship the game, integrate all the the assets and stuff to make it work and ship a final product. But we didn't have that in cloud. And what we ended up seeing over time was we had different groups. Like I said, our focus is on making games, not on delivering any of that kind of infrastructure, and the infrastructure is kind of a byproduct of delivering a game. So what we ended up doing is when Amazon started introducing services like RDS, Elasticache, all these different things, it kind of took that out of the hands of the developers, who also were in IT teams. So now managed services made things easier, because at the end of the day, sometimes it's cool to explore and manage things on your own and tinker how it works. But at the end of the day, you just want it to work, you want it to be stable, and you don't want to have to focus on that when your focus is on your game.
Yeah, so this is something that we at AWS talk about a lot, actually. We like to call it undifferentiated heavy lifting. It's stuff that you often need to do to keep the lights on, keep the games running, but it doesn't provide unique value to get really good at it, as long as it just does as you imagine. And so what it sounds like in your organization's journey was that those folks that had previously specialized on keeping the lights on, so to say, were then able to focus on delivering middleware that was unique to your organization to help you create pipelines and tools that help you deliver your games faster to your customers, like us, gamers. When we're not up here talking about this, that's what we're doing. We're playing your games, right?
Yeah. And you know what else is interesting is that when we started in the cloud, everything that we were doing was online oriented, right? So we didn't have these requirements to talk back to our data center. We didn't have corporate use cases coming in. We want to bring these corporate applications to the cloud. We want to do building and rendering in the cloud. It was online games talking to other online services, all going over public internet with maybe some connectivity VPN or something for people just to do back-end administration stuff. And then we ended up seeing is we started seeing different teams. Remember that duplication thing you were talking about?
Yeah.
Started seeing, hey, I need a VPN. Well, what do you need that to? I need to get back to source control. Hey, I have a new CI process. I need a VPN. I need to get back to source control. We start seeing all these parallel VPNs popping up. And if you don't kind of watch what's happening around you, things get out of control really fast. Really, really fast. And you end up duplicating a lot of problems. And normally what happens when you duplicate things, everyone's solving the same problem for the first time, and you end up with an inferior solution, and you also end up with just a huge cost inefficiency, a huge burden to administer. You want to change something, you got to modify all these different things. It becomes quite a burden to manage in the end.
So if you were to give some advice to a company that is in the beginning of this journey or in the midst of this journey, what would you break that down into? Maybe you can highlight the top 3 things you would caution against or for.
Well, for one, once you give your developers kind of carte blanche access, and that's one of the things at Ubisoft, being in the gaming industry, we're not finance sector, any kind of health sector stuff, that where there's certain regulations and guidelines around it. So we try to be as open as possible when we give people access to accounts. And I think a lot of organizations are going that way now, where there's some ownership and some responsibility of an account, and those people manage the service. The problem is that we need to always have this kind of thing on top where even if you give people that full access to everything, so admin of the account, whatever it might be, you still need from an IT organization or from the global organization have oversight. And that's where tools like using organizations and service control policies come in play. Using AWS config, starting to set some config rules, things like that. Systems manager, basically being able to bring things together, even things like trusted advisor reports, just to tell people about their inefficient machines, pruning away those machines, a lot of things like that, because as you scale, like in Ubisoft's case, we went from a handful of cloud accounts to like 30, and if you look at the graph, it's exponential. And before you know it, if you don't set yourself up, you're going to be in a big cleanup mode. You're going to be retroactively going back and fixing all that tech debt that you've accumulated over the years. So if you're going into that journey of kind of going public cloud and you want to give access to people to do their things and allow kind of experimentation, just make sure you don't let it get out of control, even if you give full control to people.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned organizations, trusted advisor. I just want to shout out one other service that we have in this area that really helps you lock down the accounts without compromising on the responsibility and the trust trade-off is guardrails. So guardrails is another one of these services that we can use to kind of make sure that really strange things at the edges aren't happening, right? You know, nobody's deploying any bogus workloads to some region that there are no other workloads to, or at least you can flag that and have a conversation with the central cloud ops team about it.
Yeah, and you know, it's funny that you mentioned that because it's really, what we've always called it from the beginning was offering people cloud on rails. So if you're doing the right thing, you never notice that you might be not allowed to do something or something might get flagged. It's only when you kind of wander off that track, you kind of, like in a racing game or something, you kind of bump into the wall, and at that point, that's when we get involved. We're like, whoa, 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 what's going on there? Maybe we can help optimize the cost, maybe we can help the efficiency, or maybe we just spotted something security-wise, and that's where our team will get involved on not necessarily seeing things through because these teams are independent from each other, but get involved to the point of giving them the guidance. I'm basically acting like internal consultants for the organization effectively.
Yeah, so you mentioned before that you've been using AWS for a very long time. I'd imagine you used some of the earlier services like S3, EC2, and so on at the time.
Yeah.
Then we touched on some of the more recent and newer services. What are some of the larger technological trends you've seen at Ubisoft as you become more globalized?
So we went back, if you go back 5-6 years ago at Ubisoft, when we were still kind of a very, I guess, traditional IT shop, we were very much, a chef shop and running VMs and stuff like that. And that worked great for IT for the needs at the time, but it didn't scale for gaming. It didn't scale for us to have portable workloads, for us to be able to move stuff around and kind of further eliminate the over-the-fence problem of managing stuff. And that's when containers entered into the case. And it's been kind of a slow uptick in the beginning for containers. So we had some kind of, I guess you could say, enterprising users internally who adopted to containers for stuff like Node.js and little web applications, APIs, and stuff like that. And over time, that's the trend that things are moving in. We want to have portable workloads. We have our on-premise infrastructure that's connected with Ubisoft. And what we want to basically be able to do is offer standard based on Kubernetes, for example, in EKS and Amazon, offer the ability for people to bring their workloads where they need to be without having to re-architecture all the stuff around it. And things like managed containers and stuff like that is definitely the way to go. And ultimately that ended up, now there's a huge interest around game servers running in containers, again, for that whole platform agnostic, so that we can do development and testing on-premise, and then scale out to the cloud at a launch wherever we need to be, wherever the latency is needed. If you have a latency-sensitive game, you want to obviously be close proximity. If you're not so latency-sensitive, doesn't necessarily matter, then you're just going for that cost efficiency, right?
Yeah, I mean, even this week at reInvent, we've taken deeper steps of abstracting some of the underlying infrastructure, where if you show up with a Docker file for a container, for example, we have this new feature called capacity providers for ECS that enables you to sort of worry about your workload and application first, or a game engine first, and not need to worry about the underlying infrastructure that it's deployed to.
Yeah.
So constant innovations in that space that I'm sure you'll be reading about in the coming weeks.
Well, it's interesting because with containers, the focus is on, especially for a gaming company, we have a lot of very proprietary applications, so we're not just bundling up a bunch of open source stuff. It's proprietary stuff bundled into that. But when we start talking about traditional APIs and stuff, when we're talking to teams that aren't super familiar with cloud and stuff like that, we always direct them to managed services because they don't gain anything from that service by not doing it themselves. They're just creating a burden for themselves, they're creating an operational burden, they're affecting their SLAs, they're doing all those things where at the end of the day, if you needed to run containers, would you be doing that if you knew nothing about it, not even about necessarily Kubernetes, what would you do? And you want to run containers, you're going to go on Fargate or something like that. Why? Because it gives you, or ECS or whatever it might be, or EKS, and it just gives people the ability to roll those services out without having to maintain them, which is a huge part for our teams internally. Like I said, we focus on games first.
Great. We actually have a question from Twitch chat from Blue Abs. They're wondering if you leverage CloudFormation at all in your deployments.
We do actually. I would say that because Ubisoft is so distributed, we have some teams that use CloudFormation. Actually, a lot of teams use CloudFormation. In IT, we use it quite a bit as well. But then we have other people doing their stuff in Terraform, other people doing stuff in Ansible. And it really depends on, I guess, also the type of project. So if you get more kind of IT-oriented stuff, you might see people touching on Ansible or anything from HashiCorp. When if you get kind of people just trying to do 100% AWS native stuff, starting from the ground up, they tend to go with the building blocks that are easiest to adopt which is in this case CloudFormation. So yeah, a lot of CloudFormation is definitely being used in the organization today.
Yeah, and so we mentioned before some of the middleware that folks are now creating at Ubisoft to help make everyone a little more efficient. Just to make this a little more tangible for the folks at home, examples of that are like Uplay, authentication, launchers.
Yeah, so when you play a Ubisoft game, it's not just the game server that you're connecting to. There's a whole ecosystem of services around it. Like I said, when you connect to Ubisoft, no matter what game you play, or if you're playing on PC, you're going through Uplay. These are all global services that are interacting with the games. But behind the scenes, there's also connectivity needs and requirements that we have. So we have, how do we get access before a game goes to production? If we have a public endpoint that uses IP whitelisting, and we're having game lift servers, we have on-premise stuff. How do we whitelist stuff in a cloud environment where everything's dynamic? And so a lot of interesting challenges where features that we had, say, from Amazon VPC and stuff that really helped us with Direct Connect, connecting us back to our on-premise data center, allowing people to work like they would in public without having to modify. So one of the things that we never want to do is when you're testing something in dev is break how the flow will go in prod by throwing something like a proxy in place or things like that, because it's not what your application is going to be doing in the wild, right? So you want to, apples to apples always.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so.
Go ahead. Yeah, sure. So I was going to say another thing. We've talked about what it looks like to sort of unify from a technical perspective across a global organization. Just from more of a logistics perspective, what does it look like to have a studio that may be in one part of the world, like in Montreal, to deploy a game into China, another region entirely, or what have you, right?
So China presents a bunch of interesting challenges. Beyond, I'll just stick to the technical challenges with China. And one of the technical challenges, of course, with China is when you have game teams that are operating these games who, they're permitted to operate the game in China, but the team that's managing the game is outside of China. You got the Great Firewall, so you have teams that are trying to SSH, RDP to their machines and stuff like that, and VPN's not stable. Nothing's really stable, so we worked with Direct Connect in AWS to actually bridge that back to North America so that from the back end, we could get into the back end of the games to manage and maintain them at a reasonable level. But then we found out other interesting things. So we gave them connectivity, and they're like, awesome, I can SSH, RDP, I can deploy my workloads, whatever. Now I want to upload some builds to S3. That S3 endpoint in China is in China, therefore it's not going to be automatically going. It's a public endpoint in China, which means if you try to upload to S3, that traffic is going to be going directly through that Great Firewall. So then we have to introduce the idea of, hey, we need proxies out there. We need to bring these core services that would traditionally be in our data centers to China in order to basically allow these games to operate there without the connectivity limits that they have, basically.
That sounds like an awesome use case for Direct Connect. I mean, that's all the gateway networking solutions that we have. That sounds like a really creative one.
To be honest, if we didn't have Direct Connect available, we wouldn't be able to manage these games in China effectively. It would just be impossible.
I'm saying more broadly also, like this feels like the type of thing where you assume all of the problems you may have deploying in a certain region, and then everything goes well until there's a roadblock, right? And so what it sounds like here is you can actually have more stable and reproducible build pipelines where even though you face the problem in one country, for example, if this gets integrated into other parts of your deployment pipelines for other countries, it just makes everyone better off because of it, right?
Well, and that's really the strategy we're going. Ubisoft over the years has kind of moved towards a real kind of hybrid strategy where we're embracing both on-premise and public cloud. And what we want to be able to do is ensure that we can move those workloads around very easily, and we don't have to rely on recreating these things. So one of the things coming out of that solution that we have in China is that kind of hub and spoke model we built out there, bringing those services is what we actually want to bring to our bigger hubs outside of China. And again, the reason is that if you go back 4, 5, 6 years ago, everything was online. We didn't have requirements to have connectivity at multiple gigabits per second. We didn't have 4 nines or 3 nines of uptime requirements for business critical applications that are operating the business behind the scenes. So it was okay back then, but now we don't have that, and we don't want to have to recreate the wheel with a new team every time, because like I said, whenever you recreate the wheel, you just deliver an inferior solution at the end of the day.
All right, we have time for one last question before we close out. Jonah Joe from chat wants to know, is there anything special you do for low latency gaming? So I'd imagine points of presence or dedicated game servers close to customers.
Yeah, I'd say that that's probably the biggest one, and that's also why Ubisoft is trying to focus a lot on being cloud agnostic. So the idea basically is that a lot of games, if you're talking about a traditional mobile game, you don't have unless it's like a first-person shooter, all the battle royale games that are coming out now, generally what will happen is they're not very latency sensitive. So your traffic back and forth, a lot of times it's TCP traffic, stuff like that, but when you're playing games, any kind of first-person shooter or game server-based games, talking about all UDP traffic, and the main focus there is literally just getting as close as you can to the gamer. And making sure, and that's really what it comes down to, is making those services distributed out, but then whenever we bring those services there, these services need to talk to the back end. So you connect as a gamer to a game server, but that game server is talking to a bunch of things behind the scenes, and you got to make sure that all that works where you bring it. So you can't just deploy servers independently and it's just this little autonomous machine. There's an ecosystem that goes with it.
Yeah, gone are the good old days where we just stand up a Quake server, let it go, and
Run it from your closet in your bedroom,
yeah,
right?
Name it
right,
after
right.
your pet or something.
Hooking up the T1 in your school, and it's
Yeah.
why is the network so slow?
Yeah.
All right, unfortunately we're out of time. I wish we could go on for hours, but Trevor Hammond, again, thank you, Public Cloud Architect Lead at Ubisoft. Thank you for tuning in. Stick around and we'll have more Launchpad content coming at you in just a bit.